Hi, I'm Alaskan photographer Jeff Schultz, and recently I did a video showing the backstory to how I made this picture, Moose and Pond. And it's gotten a lot of attention on social media, and so we decided to do a video about the backstory of how that image was processed. And I'm here today to introduce my assistant, Trent Grassi. Trent's been working with me for many years, and he does most all of my image processing. I do a few tweaks after he's done, but for the most part, he does everything. So he's here today, and he's going to explain the backstory to how he processed that moose and pond photo.
All right, guys, I'm going to take you over to my computer in just a moment and show you some about how we used Adobe Lightroom to create the final look of that image that you guys saw on Facebook and in the video that Jeff did where he explained the story of the image. So we're going to go over and switch to that view right now. This is the photo as we've posted it online, and it was on Facebook and on our site like this. What we're going to look at today is how the image was shot originally, and then how the image was processed to look like this. Now, Jeff already posted a video about this particular image where he told the story of how he got this photo and sort of the experience involved, and we're going to link that video in the description below so you can watch it. You don't have to watch that before you watch this, but I would definitely recommend that you do. It'll just be a good start in understanding the story behind the image, and Jeff talks a bit about what made this image difficult to capture, and he also talked a little bit about what happened during capture that made post-processing it more difficult. And we're going to talk about that a little bit too. What Jeff said was that he didn't have his graduated neutral density filters, which is the kind of filter he uses while he's shooting a lot, to use while shooting this image. And so what we ended up with was a shot with a lot of contrast. And this is the shot as it came out of the camera. As you can see up here at the top, towards the top of the image, we have some really bright highlights. But and that is even exposing so that these highlights are so bright, the front portion of the image is almost completely in shadow. So you don't even barely see the moose, which was what the photo was all about, was the moose in the pond. And your eyes are just completely drawn up to this this blown out highlight in the upper portion of the image. So that is largely because it wasn't shot with a graduated neutral density filter, which is a kind of filter you use to balance exposure between the foreground and the background, especially in landscape images. So we didn't use one of those filters in shooting the image, but because of digital technology and the way that we can work with post-processing images, we can actually add that filter in after the fact, after the image was shot. So we're looking at here what the image looks like raw out of the camera. And again, this moose that the image are all about, we can just barely see that they're there. The pond is dark, and your eye is just drawn up to this sky area, which is not what the image was really meant to be about. So we need to make some adjustments to this image to get it to look and work more the way we wanted it to. So the first thing that I would do when processing this image or any other image is I just have a base preset I use in Lightroom that applies some adjustments that just I feel like get me to a better starting place than directly out of the camera for processing photos. And all it does is adjust this clarity slider up to 20, the vibrance slider up to 20, and switches it to camera standard color rather than Adobe standard color, which is Lightroom's default. With just about every camera, it goes to their own color profile instead of the profiles that emulate the camera's internal look. So I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a second. The clarity slider, which is the first one adjust, just gives the image a little bit more punch. It creates more contrast in the areas, like on a small scale. Like things right next to each other get more contrast with each other, but it doesn't affect the image's overall contrast. It's a hard one to explain. I don't know if I did very well at explaining it, but you can find descriptions online that describe more specifically what the clarity slider does. And the best thing, and what I recommend you do, is you open it in one of your images in Lightroom and you move the adjustment up and down and see the effect it has on the image. The vibrance slider is one of our two sliders we have in Lightroom that affect the level of color, the saturation of color in the image. We have vibrance and saturation. Typically, I just use the vibrance slider, and the reason for that is what vibrance is it's basically the same adjustment saturation is, but it uses an algorithm to try not to oversaturate colors that are getting too saturated while still saturating some of the colors that are less saturated. So it tries to make it so that you don't have sort of a negative impact on your image by adding too much saturation on colors. It just uses sort of a smart adjustment. Most of the time, I think it works better than using the standard saturation adjustment. What I have noticed is sometimes it favors, like the algorithm just tends to favor cooler colors over warmer colors, and you get this look of the image just being really oversaturated in the cool colors compared to the warm colors. And if you're starting to see that effect from adjusting vibrance, you might bring vibrance back a little bit and try adding some saturation too to see if you can get the level of color you want without getting that imbalance. But most of the time, 99 times out of 100, I just adjust vibrance. So you don't need to use saturation too much. And this, the other thing that the auto tool does is it adds the lens correction, the lens profile correction in Adobe Lightroom, and it adds the remove chromatic aberration checkbox. I suggest whatever you do for your base level, if you're going to do a preset to your images to get them to a starting point, that you absolutely do that. You definitely want the lens correction and the remove chromatic aberrations. It just helps compensate for the optical failings of whatever lens you're using. Adobe's taken all the lenses, they've looked at them, they've seen what problems they have, and they've made some automatic adjustments that help fix vignetting from the lens, where the outside gets darker, optical distortion from the lens, which all lenses have to a degree. It tries to fix it as well as it can. It doesn't make it so that there's no impact from the optics of the lens, but it tries to remove any of the known failings of that lens that they've tried to adjust for. So it's always a good thing. And then chromatic aberrations are another issue that some lenses have. All lenses have, but some more than others, that can be fixed with software, and Adobe's pretty good at doing it automatically. So I tend to check both those boxes on every image. And then the other thing is most cameras will default to this Adobe standard color profile. I tend to use the camera standard one. That's the one Jeff sees in the camera when he's taking the photos. When I adjust from camera standard, I'm looking at the starting point much closer to what Jeff saw when he was shooting, so I feel like it's a better starting place for me editing. It also, in my mind, typically produces better, more natural looking color than the Adobe standard profile that Adobe likes to use. I would tend to always go with the camera standard profile, unless you're someone who has done the work of profiling all your cameras, and it's something you can do. I don't think you need to do. But if you have your own color profiles for your cameras, you can use those. But we just use the camera standard one most all the time. So let's get to this image in particular and adjustments that we need to make to it. So when we're looking at this image, it is quite dark in the foreground, so much so that we can barely see the moose, which is what, again, the photo is all about. And the highlights up here are just really, really bright, and we need to work on fixing this. And oftentimes when I'm faced with this much contrast in an image, the first thing I'll do is I'll just adjust the shadow slider all the way to 100 and the highlight slider all the way to minus 100. What I've done there is I've basically removed as much contrast globally from the image as I can do with the is even possible with the sliders, the basic sliders in Lightroom, because that gives me a better starting place on an image like this than where I was before. Where I was before, it's just so contrasty. I can't even see what I want to do with the image. So I may choose to back some of these off, but I'd rather start here on this image than where I started with, the base settings. So that's something to think about when you have this really contrasty scene where you can barely see the image. Maybe just go all the way and then adjust from there. And actually on this image, it actually works. with that adjustment all the way. I am actually probably not going to back that off. A lot of times when I do that, I do back it off. But here, I think the minus 100 plus 100 on highlights and shadows works well enough, and I'm not seeing, flat looking parts of the image that make me think that it's overdone. But when I look at my moose, they're still too dark. They're not exposed bright enough. And so one of the first adjustments I would make after doing that is just the overall exposure adjustment, which is something you always want to adjust, I think, early on in an image. And with this image, we're just going to use the keyboard and push it up 1/10 of a stop at a time until the moose look as bright as I want them to be, and maybe even a little brighter. And we're, I think, at the point now, maybe even one more step, because I want them to be maybe even brighter than I need them to be, because I'm going to end up darkening them a little bit with a radial filter in a moment. Now, you'll have noticed while I was doing that adjustment, the image got way too bright. Like, this is not what we're looking for with this photo everywhere except for on the moose. The moose looked pretty good. The rest of the image is overexposed. But I did that adjustment just to get my moose where I wanted them to be. I knew the image would get overexposed besides that. And that's okay. Like, this is definitely brighter. This foreground area is brighter than we want it to be. The mountain is way overexposed. So what we're going to do is actually fix that in the next step. So we're going to take the radial filter, which is this filter right here. It's one of the local adjustments we have in Lightroom. We have 3 major local adjustment tools. We have the radial filter, which is the circular one. We have the graduated filter, which is the one you'll probably use the most, especially if you're doing a lot of landscape photos. And as we were speaking earlier, Jeff was going to use an in-camera graduated filter, which is basically a tool in camera that does the same thing that this does in post, but we have a bit more control on it in post. But there's some ways in which the quality is better if you do it in camera. So there's arguments either way. Today on this photo, we're going to do it completely in post, but we're not going to do that yet. And then we also have this paintbrush tool, which allows us to brush adjustments anywhere on the image we want. And we won't probably demo that one today, but we might. We'll see how the image adjusts as we go. We might end up using a little paintbrush on it. But we'll definitely do it in future videos on this channel. But the thing we're going to start with today is this one right here in the middle, this circular one, which is called the radial filter. And to use it, one of the first things I recommend you do is right where it says effect right here, double click. Before you do any of these filters, always double click on effect. What that does is it zeroes the adjustments out so that you're applying it with no adjustment. If you have one of these moved somewhere, you'll see that as you're adding your filter into the image, and you may not want to. So I sometimes forget to do it, but the easiest way is to start just by clicking effect. That gets you everything down to 0, so you're right at like starting point. And what I'm looking at is I'm looking at my moose, and I'm just going to draw a bubble around them. Kind of a big bubble that extends beyond them. And the reason for that is I'll demo for you in a minute. And then I'm going to click outside, and I'm going to allow me to adjust my bubble so that it's shaped sort of like the area around my moose. I'm going to move my pin so that it's kind of in the middle of my moose occupied area of the image. And I'm going to even sort of move that part up a little bit. And I'm going to get it just kind of centered on my moose. Now I've got my bubble. And I can now apply adjustments. And the adjustments will apply outside of the image, but the adjustments will not apply to the moose themselves. And we have this cool little slider here that's called Feather. And just to demo what Feather does, I'm going to add a really dramatic exposure adjustment. So I'm not keeping that. I just want to show you guys what Feather means. And this is what Feather always means in imaging applications, whether you're using Photoshop, Lightroom, or anything else. When you see the word Feather, this is what it's talking about. As we go down, we get this transition where there's basically no transition. It's just, there's the effect, there's no effect. And as we go up, the transition gets really soft and it moves across a large area it's more subtle. And in the case of what I'm doing today, I want my feather all the way up. But this crazy adjustment to exposure is not what I want. I'm going to reduce that quite a lot. I'm and I'm just going to adjust exposure until it looks kind of good. And it's just something eyeball, and we move it around. And I'm liking this minus 0.90. I'm seeing about what I'd like to see in the image outside of the of my little bubble around the moose. My moose are still exposed the way they were. They got a little darker because it feathered over them a little bit, but I knew that was going to happen, and that's why I went a little too bright when I adjusted the moose to begin with. So now I've got a really nice effect where if I turn off my radio filter and go just to where my exposure was, where everything was just way too bright except for my moose, I've now sort of evened everything out, and I've got a lot more pleasant effect of the image. But one thing I'm starting to notice is that I'm looking at areas of the foreground. In the foreground, you have to remember from the original photo, was almost completely shadow. And what tends to happen when you make adjustments to an image dramatically like this, where you remove a lot of shadow from an area of an image, is that the area that used to be in shadow looks a little undersaturated. And just the level of color in the trees, the level of color in this yellow grass, the yellow of color in the moose's coat, it's not saturated enough. And so even though I've already got like a base level vibrance increase that I sort of what I typically use, I'm going to go ahead and increase the vibrance more, maybe even almost to double where I had it, just to get sort of warmer yellows, brighter greens, the moose's coat in with a little bit more, saturated brown, just to get to that image to where I'm thinking it's starting to look a little bit colorful again. And at this point, we're starting to really come together. We started with an image that was quite, let's see, I want to move us back to, we had an image that was super dark, and we couldn't see the moose, the highlights were overexposed, we didn't really get to enjoy the moose at the pond, the eye was drawn away from the subject of the image because of this highlight at the top of the image, and it just didn't make us see the image the way that the eye would see it, because the human eye is very different from the camera. Your human eye can look at a scene this contrasty, and your brain and your eye work together to create an image where you see detail into really bright highlights and really dark shadows, and as your attention focuses on areas that are different amounts of light, your brain actually adjusts it, so you never really perceive things like this. And a lot of what we're doing in post-processing is just making them look more like human perception. And now that we can see into the shadows and at the same time into the highlights, that's a much more natural way of looking at it. As we look at this image, I'm starting to think that the white balance is maybe slightly off. It's a little bit warm. That's just something I'm noticing as I'm processing it. And again, I'm going to use the keyboard, and we're going to use the color temperature tool. That's going to be your main tool that you use for adjusting white balance. And in case anyone doesn't know the term white balance, it's a term we use to describe the color of light in a scene we're photographing. Different light sources like light bulbs, fluorescent tubes, and the sun have very different levels of color. And again, your brain is always filtering that out. But in camera, we have to make sure that we adjust for it, because the camera will see it in a way that our eyes don't. So this image looks a little too warm to me, so I am going to make an adjustment on the white balance, sort of making it a little bit cooler in just a couple steps, like 3 clicks of the keyboard, and it honestly looks pretty good to me. In fact, I think I maybe went too far, and I'm going to adjust it back one. And then maybe again a little bit more of a saturation increase through the vibrance tool, not through the saturation tool, to get this image where I want it to be. And we're getting a lot closer to the sort of finished look we had with the online one. I should say it won't end up looking exactly like the other one, because I'm not a machine and I don't repeat things exactly the same way I did them before. But we're going to get to basically the same place. I don't know where I might lose my camera feed for a moment because we had some issues with the camera shutting off. It tends to do that, I guess, but we'll try to work through it. You may have seen me disappear in the corner there for a moment. I should be back now. What we're looking at here is the graduated filter tool, which is one of the most important tools we use in Lightroom. And it's especially important if you're a landscape photographer. And Jeff, in his previous video that he shot talking about how this image was shot, he talked about not having his graduated filters with him when he was shooting. And that is, what he's talking about is an in-camera piece of glass that you put in front of the lens that adjusts, basically makes the background darker and compared to the foreground. And it's something that we can actually use in camera. It's literally something we're putting in front of the lens. What today we're looking at in Lightroom is we're looking at a post-processing graduated filter. And as I told you guys, when you do the radial filter, whenever you open these local adjustments, the first thing you want to do is double-click on the word effect to zero everything out so that there's no adjustment at all there. They're all zeroed. And then much like the radial filter, the way we apply this is we click somewhere in the image and then we drag. Now, as you can see, we get these 3 lines when we're making a graduated filter, and we can adjust the angle and the distance between the lines. What this does is it applies an effect. I'm going to just make a crazy exposure adjustment. We don't actually want that much exposure adjustment, but it helps us see what is moving when we do this. So the 3 lines kind of mean something. So the first line at the top is everything above that point got 100% of the adjustment we made. So a 2.65 stop adjustment to exposure applies to everything above the top line. It's 50% off at this middle line. And then there is no effect of the adjustment below the bottom line. So what this shows is the size of the transition. That's what's really important is understanding, is that from top line to bottom line is how dramatically it transitions. We can get to a point where you can really see that we've put this filter on top of the image, and we can make it much bigger and kind of make it soft so that you can't see where it starts and stops, and if it wasn't so overdone, you might not even know a filter was applied, which is always kind of what you're shooting for. So we're going to create a relatively big graduation from there to there, and we're going to affect everything kind of above here 100%, and then it's going to get less and less as we get down into the valley here. And we're going to make a little bit more, a little darker exposure adjustment, but we're going to also do a plus adjustment on the shadows so nothing gets too dark, but we want to really try to get the sky down a little bit. So we'll adjust the shadows up, we'll bring the overall, and we might even bring the highlights specifically down because that will kind of target the sky and make the sky less bright. Because what we're addressing here, and we'll do it by, this switch right here will let me turn off just my top filter that I'm doing right now for you, is we're trying to make the sky less bright, because even though the sky isn't overexposed anymore, it still is drawing your eye away from the moose. And the image needs to be all about this, and we tend to look at brighter stuff. So that adjustment that I just made to the sky by just doing some quick things with our graduated filter, just an exposure down, and the exposure is brought down obviously to make it darker. The highlights are brought down to make it darker and focus more specifically on the sky. And then the shadow adjustment up was to make it so that this area in the valley just didn't get too dark. So we just did a few adjustments here. You can always play with this stuff and see what different effects have. There's a lot of tools that you can use on these local adjustments. But the exposure, highlights, and shadows are probably the ones you're going to use the most. And that is maybe still a little too heavy on exposure. I'm going to reduce that one a little bit. But what we're trying to achieve is to get the sky area to not be drawing the eye away from the moose. And I think we were pretty successful in that. I think the image is still like a little globally too dark. I'm going to go back to my global adjustments and just adjust the exposure up even another bit. so that maybe right around 0.16 here, and we're, I think, pretty close to having the image exactly how we want it. These moose are really the center of attention now. You can see detail all the way into the valley and all the way up through these shadows. The sky is not overexposed, and it's not overpowering the image. It's all about the moose now. We have some nice color in the foreground here where the meadow looks, I think, natural. The moose's pelt has some nice warm browns in it. We've gone from, let's go back to our original setup. We've gone from an image we could hardly see. I mean, it's fair to say we could hardly see it, to an image where we really have our moose in the image exposed well, the sky isn't overpowering the image. We've really come a long way. And I want to go back to our original image one more time. Oops, I want the cropped version though. Sorry. There we go. So it's important to note that this isn't a bad exposure. If we look at the histogram, it's this area up in the corner here. It was exposed the way it was intended to. Jeff made sure that he got the best balance between not making the shadows too dark and not making the highlights too bright, so that I was able to come in post-production and I didn't have highlights I couldn't recover and I didn't have shadows I couldn't recover. I had an image where it was balanced enough. He could have shot it to where you saw the moose really well, but this area up here was just completely white, like there was no detail left at all. And then we wouldn't have been able to fix it in post. And at the same time, he could have shot it so that this area, the sky, just looked perfectly exposed, but the moose wouldn't have even been visible. It would have just been totally black. This sort of balanced in-between exposure he made, where he made sure in camera, and you can view this histogram in camera on any model of camera. Look in your camera manual for how to do that. He was able to see that he had enough area, he had enough detail for me to work with both in the shadows and highlights to get a finished product that looked a lot more like what he was aiming for. And that's really important, that you don't think that you have to make the image look the way you want it to look in the camera. Instead, you want to shoot images so that they can be adjusted to look well, from that there's enough detail left to adjust the image to a good place. And that's very much what Jeff did, and that's why we got such a great end result, I think. We're going to do some more videos on this channel. We want to do more post-processing videos where we tell the story of how images were both shot and how they were processed. We want to do more videos that show all kinds of different things on the channel, and we want you guys to drop us a line and tell us in the comments below what you guys want to see in future videos. Do you want to see more how to use Lightroom? Do you want me to break down certain tools in Lightroom? Do you want to see images where Jeff tells the story of how images were shot? Do you want to see more videos about Iditarod? Tell us in the comments below what we can do on this channel. Like the video and subscribe to the channel if you liked it. If you're viewing on Facebook, please like the video on Facebook. And that's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope to do more videos on this channel for you. This is the first time I'm appearing on camera. We're giving it a try. We're going to try, like I said, a lot of different things. But I hope that this worked for you, and I hope that you guys learned something, and I hope we can do more videos in the future. Take care.